The descending tracts, they are known as descending because they are moving from the cerebrum or from the brain down towards the spinal cord and the brain stem. So they are moving down. The axons are transmitting impulses downwards. Because the ascending tract, you say that impulses are moving towards the brain and the cerebrum. They are moving upwards. Those were sensory. Now the brain sends down motor. And then the axons from the brain, from the motor areas of the brain, transmit those impulses downwards. From the motor areas of the cerebrum, those axons that transmit motor impulses downwards to the brain stem and to the spinal cord are known as descending tracts. So in principle, the tracts transmit motor impulses to the muscles of the body. And in principle, descending tracts are made up of two neurons. The neuron which picks impulses from the motor areas of the cerebrum to the brain stem or to the spinal cord is known as the upper motor neuron. And then the neuron which picks those impulses from the brain stem or spinal cord and transmits it to the muscles, those are known as the lower motor neuron. So in principle, the descending tracts have two orders of neurons. The first order, which is the upper motor neuron, and the second order, which is the lower motor neuron. And you can see now that the lower motor neuron is the neuron which picks motor impulses from the brain stem or from the spinal cord and transmits it to the muscle. So it is the only neuron connecting the muscle to the central nervous system. That's the lower motor neuron. And when it is leaving the spinal cord, for those ones which come from the spinal cord, it passes through the anterior root of the spinal nerve, as opposed to the sensory that we saw in the ascending tracts, which pass through the posterior root. And I will give more examples. So, what are the divisions of the descending tracts? What are the divisions of the descending tracts? The descending tracts have two major divisions. Two major divisions. Yes, they transmit motor impulses from the brain downwards to the brain stem and to the spinal cord. But they are divided into two major divisions. The first division is known as the pyramidal tract. The pyramidal tract. When we're looking at the medulla oblongata, we are going to see the region of the medulla oblongata known as the pyramid. Those pyramids of the medulla oblongata contain descending tracts. And because those descending tracts are passing through the pyramids of the medulla, we call them the pyramidal tract. So one of the major divisions of the descending tracts is known as the pyramidal tract. Under the pyramidal tract, we have what we call the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. So these subdivisions of the descending tract known as the pyramidal tract is made up of two components, the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. The corticospinal tract just tells us that axons of motor neurons or axons of upper motor neurons are transmitting motor impulses from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. And axons of the corticobulbar tract are transmitting motor impulses from the cerebral cortex to the brain stem. So these descending tracts of the corticospinal, their upper motor neurons end at the spinal cord. And these descending tracts of the corticobulbar, their upper motor neuron end at the brain stem. And both the corticospinal and the corticobulbar are under what we call the pyramidal tract, one of the subdivisions of the descending tract. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing the corticospinal. These axons are picking motor impulses from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, and they are transmitting them down to the spinal cord. So these are the upper motor neurons of the corticospinal tract. They pick motor impulses from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Their axons move down and then they reach the spinal cord. That is why they call them corticospinal. And when they reach the spinal cord, that is when they synapse with lower motor neurons, which pick those from them and transmit them to the muscles of the body. So this is what we call the corticospinal tract. So these axons, when after picking motor impulses from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, they pass through this region known as the corona radiata. Then they pass through this region known as the internal capsule. When they reach the midbrain, we call them the cerebral peduncles. When they reach the pons, we call them the pyramidal tract. When they reach the medulla oblongata, we call them the pyramids. Let me repeat, and I want you to pay attention. I said that the descending tracts are divided into two major divisions: the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tract. The pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tract. Those are the two divisions of the descending tracts. Under the pyramidal tract, we have two components: the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. This illustration is showing us the corticospinal tract, where the upper motor neurons pick motor impulses from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Their axons move down. They pass through this region of divergence known as the corona radiata. Then they pass through this narrow region lateral to the thalamus known as the internal capsule. When these descending tracts reach the midbrain, we call them the cerebral peduncles. When they reach the pons, we call them pyramidal tract. And when they reach the medulla, we call them pyramids. They are taking up different names as they are passing through the brain stem. Because the brain stem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. These ones are what we call the brain stem. So when the descending tracts are passing through the midbrain, we call them cerebral peduncles. When they are passing through the pons, we call them the pyramidal tract. And when they reach the medulla oblongata, we call them pyramids. And they are made up of axons of upper motor neurons. Now, when they reach the medulla, we call them the pyramids. Now, what happens to them after they have reached the medulla? And they are now known as the pyramids. What happens to them? 90% of them decussate or cross to the opposite side. 90% of them cross to the opposite side or decussate. And they will descend on the opposite side as the lateral corticospinal tract until they reach the spinal cord. The 10% will remain on the ipsilateral or the same side, and they will descend as the anterior corticospinal tract until they reach their points of termination at the spinal cord. But when they reach the spinal cord, they will also cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord. So at the end of it all, they will also cross. But for them, they but then 90% decussated at the point of the medulla. But even these ones which remain at the same side of the ipsilateral side will then decussate at the level of the spinal cord. So tracts, which when they reach the medulla oblongata, they are known as the pyramid, to the ipsilateral side, and then the lateral, which crosses to the opposite side. But at the same time, at the end of it all, the anterior, which remained on the ipsilateral side, will also decussate and move to the opposite side. So when these axons of the upper motor neurons reach the spinal cord, then they synapse with lower motor neurons, which will pick the impulses from them and transmit them to the body muscles. So these are the lower motor neurons, meaning that the upper motor neurons are these ones which you call the first order, and then the lower motor neurons are these ones which you call the second order neurons. This is what you call the corticospinal tract. The other division of the pyramidal tract is the corticobulbar tract. You're seeing that the corticobulbar tracts, the axons of the upper motor neurons are not going to reach the spinal cord. They are going to end at the brain stem, which is made up of the midbrain, medulla, midbrain, pons, and the medulla. So this part of the pyramidal tract, the upper motor neurons terminate or end at the brain stem. Whereas for the corticospinal, the upper motor neurons end at the spinal cord. And both the corticospinal and the corticobulbar are under what you call the pyramidal tract of the descending system. Why do these upper motor neurons end at the brain stem? They end at the brain stem. When they reach the brain stem, they cross to the opposite side. Why do they end at the brain stem? They end at the brain stem because they are going to synapse with the lower motor neurons of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves which are motor are the ones which receive impulses from the corticobulbar tract. So these corticobulbar tract axons are going to go, when they reach the brain stem, they're going to cross to the opposite side, and they will synapse at the nuclei of the motor cranial nerves. Then from the nuclei of the motor cranial nerves, we are going to have lower motor neurons which are going to go and pass through cranial nerves, and they will go and supply muscles of the face and muscles of the neck. In simple terms, the corticobulbar tract is transmitting impulses to the lower motor neurons of cranial nerves, whereas the corticospinal is transmitting impulses to the lower motor neurons of the spinal cord. And both the corticobulbar and the corticospinal are under the pyramidal tract. This is responsible for the supply of the rest of the muscles of the body below the neck. And these ones, because they are going to transmit impulses to nuclei of cranial nerves, they are responsible for transmitting impulses which are going to be transmitted through the cranial nerves supplying the head and the neck. Both of them are referred to as the pyramidal tract. So the pyramidal tract is one of the major divisions of the descending tract. The other division of the descending tract is what we call the extrapyramidal tract. These ones, number one, they do not pass through the pyramids. That's why they call them extrapyramidal tract. Number two, their upper motor neurons do not originate from the cerebral cortex, but their upper motor neurons originate from the brain stem. Here we saw in the pyramidal tract, which is made up of the corticospinal and corticobulbar, that for them, their upper motor neurons originate from the cerebral cortex. However, the upper motor neurons of the extrapyramidal tract do not originate from the cerebral cortex. No, for them, they originate from the brain stem. And then those upper motor neuron axons of the extrapyramidal tract, after originating from the brainstem, they are going to transmit impulses to the spinal cord. Their major function is to control involuntary movement. Involuntary movement is movement which is not under your voluntary control. They also control muscle tone. Muscle tone is the force of contraction within your muscles. They control it depending on the circumstances. When do you need it more? When you need it, when do you need a greater force? When do you need a lesser force? So they control the tone, which is the force of contraction or the tension within the muscle. They are involved in balance and posture, and they are very important in the planning of motor activities. So these ones control the extrapyramidal tracts. They do not pass through the pyramids. They originate from the brainstem, and they control involuntary movements. Whereas the pyramidal we've seen, those ones control voluntary movements. So when they ask you what are the two divisions of the descending tract, we talked about the pyramidal tract, which is made up of the corticospinal and the corticobulbar, which control voluntary movements. The movements you perform under your voluntary control. The corticospinal, the rest of the muscles below the neck, and the corticobulbar, the muscles of the head and the neck, but voluntary. Whereas the extrapyramidal, it does not originate from the cerebral cortex, and it controls or it participates in the control of involuntary movements and balance. An example of the extrapyramidal tract, we have four major tracts under the extrapyramidal. Rubrospinal, Vestibulospinal, which has a lateral and medial, Reticulospinal, and Tectospinal. These are the four components which are under the extrapyramidal tract. But for the pyramidal tract, we saw two, corticospinal and corticobulbar. But under the extrapyramidal tract, we have rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and tectospinal. So those are the major divisions of the descending tracts: the pyramidal and the components under pyramidal, the extrapyramidal and the components under extrapyramidal. The pyramidal controlling voluntary muscle activity for the head and neck, that is the corticobulbar, and for the rest of the body, that is corticospinal. Whereas the extrapyramidal controlling involuntary muscle activity and balance. And under extrapyramidal, we have the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and tectospinal. And we are going to look at them and what each of them does. So an example of the extrapyramidal tracts, I've indicated them here, and I'll go into the details when the time comes. The rubrospinal, the reticulospinal, the vestibulospinal, and also the tectospinal. We shall look at each of them and what each of them does. So, whenever we are talking about upper motor neurons, those are the neurons which pick impulses from the brain, or motor neurons which pick impulses from the cerebral cortex or from the brainstem and transmit them down to the spinal cord or the brainstem. There they have to synapse with the lower motor neuron, which is also the second order neuron, which is going to pass through the anterior root of the spinal cord, and it will go and supply the muscle. So this is the lower motor neuron. And when these axons are coming down to the spinal cord specifically for the corticospinal, they will go to the anterior horn. And in the anterior horn, that's where they are going to synapse to the lower motor neuron, which is going to pass to the anterior root and go to the muscle. Remember, we saw that when our first order neurons of the ascending tracts are coming to the spinal cord, for them they pass to the posterior root and they go to the posterior horn. But now the motor are coming down to the anterior horn and then passing to the anterior root. When we are talking about the embryology of the spinal cord, you remember that the gray matter differentiates into the basal plate and the ala plate, and those plates form the posterior and anterior horns, and the neurons of the anterior horns differentiate into motor, the neurons of the posterior horns differentiate into sensory. That is why these motor upper motor neuron axons will go to the anterior horn where we have motor neurons. So whenever I talk about the upper motor neuron, I'm talking about this neuron which picks impulses from the brain or the brainstem and transmits it down. Then it will synapse to the lower motor neuron, which is going to move out of the central nervous system and it will go and supply the muscle. The same applies to that. This is a pyramidal tract. The pyramidal tract is a corticospinal which go up to the spinal cord, and I say that when they reach the medulla oblongata, we are known as pyramids. Then 9% cross to the opposite side and descend as the lateral corticospinal tract. Then the 10% remains on the same side, and most of them will also, when they reach the spinal cord, will be cassette. Then we have the corticobulbar. Corticobulbar are going to end at the brain stem, midbrain, pons, and medulla. And these ones are going to synapse with lower motor neurons of cranial nerve, like the trigeminal, like the oculomotor, like the hypoglossal, like the facial. Those ones which have motor neurons within them. So this is the pyramidal tract made up of the corticospinal and then the corticobulbar. Motor impulses through the corticobulbar are going to cranial nerves, and motor impulses through the corticospinal are going to the rest of the nerves of the body. And I said that when these descending tracts reach the medulla oblongata, the corticospinal, 90% decassate. And this is two-way. The ones on the left cross to the right, and the ones on the right cross to the left. And at this point where these descending tracts decassate, we call that the decassation of pyramids. The 90% remain on the same side as the anterior corticospinal tract, which will on reaching the spinal cord also cross to the opposite side. So that is what we call the pyramidal tract, made up of the corticospinal and the corticobulbar. This is another example of the corticospinal tract. You can see the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Then they move down. And then when they reach the pyramids, most of them cross. That is 90%. Some will say 80%, some will say 90%. And then they descend as the lateral corticospinal tract. Then they will synapse with the lower motor neurons, which will go and supply the muscles. Then the rest, the 90 or the 10 or 20%, because different sources give different percentages, will remain on the same side as the anterior or ventral corticospinal tracts. These ones are two-way. They will give supply to the ipsilateral side and also to the opposite side, because when they reach the spinal cord, they are going to synapse with an interneuron. Then this interneuron is going to transmit some to the opposite side and transmit some to the same side, and then the lower motor neurons are going to pick those impulses and then take them to the muscle. So this anterior corticospinal tract, which does not decassate at the pyramids, when it reaches the spinal cord, it is going to synapse with an interneuron. An interneuron is a small neuron connecting two neurons. This interneuron is going to transmit impulses to the opposite side and also the same side, where it will synapse with lower motor neurons on the opposite side, which will transmit those impulses to the muscles of the body. So this is how the ones which remain on the same side, which don't decassette the pyramid, this is how they behave. And these notes are talking about the exact thing I've been talking about. I say that majority cross to the opposite side at the level of the medulla, and they descend as the lateral corticospinal tracts. A few do not cross, they remain on the same side, and they move down as the anterior corticospinal tract to the spinal cord. But when they reach the spinal cord, they will synapse with an interneuron, which will transmit impulses to the opposite side and to the same side. And here I say that those ones which remain on the same side, that is the anterior corticospinal tract, many of them will eventually cross to the opposite side when they reach the spinal cord. And that crossing is either in the neck portion or the upper thoracic portion of the spinal cord. So what does that mean? It means that the anterior corticospinal tract transmits impulses to upper muscles, muscles of the neck, and then the upper thorax. Whereas the lateral, which decassettes, transmits impulses to distal muscles, muscles of the lower thorax and downwards, the lower limb. So whenever they're talking about the corticospinal tract behavior at the level of the medulla, we shall say that when the corticospinal tracts reach the medulla, we call them pyramids. Most of them decassette to the opposite side and descend as the lateral corticospinal tract. And a few will remain on the ipsilateral side, but when they reach the upper extremities of the spinal cord, they will synapse with the interneurons, which will transmit impulses to the opposite side and to the ipsilateral side. And then both of them for the lateral corticospinal and the ventral or anterior corticospinal, after they have crossed the opposite side, they synapse with lower motor neurons, and those lower motor neurons are going to transmit those impulses to the muscles of the body. For the ones coming through the lateral corticospinal tract, they are going to supply muscles of the lower thorax and the lower extremities. And those ones which are coming through the anterior corticospinal, they are going to supply muscles of the neck and upper thorax. Those are our corticospinal tracts, and that is how they move. Are you still hearing me, members?
We can hear you, sir.
Okay. The corticospinal tracts, they control voluntary movements. Movements which you carry out under your voluntary control. Some of the upper motor neurons of the corticospinal tract originate from the somatosensory cortex. So they are the ones which are very important in the reflex activities, such that when you touch something hot, you immediately remove your hand. because those impulses of temperature are going to go to the somatosensory cortex, and we have some upper motor neurons in the somatosensory cortex. When that temperature is interpreted, those neurons are going to be transmitting motor impulses down so that you take away your hand. So much as most of them control voluntary movements, but some of them, which originate from the somatosensory cortex, which are in response to the sensory stimuli, are very important for reflex activities like removing your hand when you have touched something hot. And here I'm saying that because some of the connections cross the median, because most of these descending tracts cross to the opposite side, it means that the tract on the right is responsible for controlling muscles on the left, and the tract on the left is responsible for controlling muscles on the right. So here I'm saying that because some of the connections cross the midline, those are the ones which decussate, and the other ones which finally cross at the level of the spinal cord. So because some of them cross the midline, each side of the brain is responsible for controlling muscles or for the limbs on the opposite side of the body, while controlling the trunk muscles on the same side of the body, because the pathways are for trunks remain on the same side. This is very important. For the muscles of the limbs, all those descending tracts which are crossing to the opposite side are for the muscles of the limbs. The ones we have seen decussating are for the muscles of the limbs. And a few which do not cross are for the muscles of the trunk. Trunk, I'm talking about thorax. I'm talking about abdomen. I'm talking about pelvis. That's the trunk. So the motor neurons which you are seeing, they are crossing, which are decussating, because most of them cross. Even when they go to the level of the spinal cord, they cross. But there are few that remain that don't cross at all. So these ones which cross the opposite side are going to supply the upper and lower limb. So for the muscle of the upper limb, it is the opposite cerebral cortex. So the muscles of the left upper limb and the left lower limb are controlled by the motor areas of the right cerebral cortex, and vice versa. That is for the limbs. But for the muscles of the trunk, they are controlled by the same motor cortex of the same side. Because for those axons, for those upper motor neurons which are going to supply the muscles of the trunk, for them, they remain on the same side, much as they are few, but they remain on the same side. And this is what I mean by this paragraph. That because some of the connections cross the midline, each side of the brain is responsible for controlling muscles for the limbs of the opposite side, while controlling trunk muscles of the same side of the body, because the pathways for the trunk remain on the same side. So the decussation, the crossing, applies for the muscles of the limbs, but for the muscles of the trunk, they remain on the same side for the corticospinal tract. So after a patient is lesioned, and a lesion is an injury. So if an individual's pyramidal tract is lesioned on one side of the body, they are going to be paralyzed on the corresponding side of the body. However, they cannot relearn some crude basic motions, just like fine movements. And I say that this implies that the connections of these tracts are crucial for fine movements, and only partial recovery is possible. What do we mean? When these corticospinal tracts are injured, for example, on the left, the corticospinal tracts of the left are injured before they decussate. Let's go back. If the corticospinal tracts are injured at this level before they cross, you're going to get paralysis. You're going to get paralysis on the upper limb muscles and lower limb muscles of the opposite side, and also on the muscles of the trunk of the same side, if the tract is injured before it decussates. So that you're going to get paralysis on the opposite side of the injury. If the injury is on the left, the paralysis is going to be on the right for upper and lower limb muscles. And if the injury is on the left still, before the decussation, for the trunk muscles, the paralysis is going to be on the same side. But if the injury is at the level of the spinal cord, the paralysis is going to be on the same side like the injury, because the injury is when the tract has already decussated. So remember and never forget that the motor impulses which cross to the opposite side are going for upper and lower limb muscles. For the trunk, they remain on the same side. And if the injury of this tract is at that point before the decussation, the paralysis is going to be on the muscles of the opposite side for the limb muscles, and for muscles of the same side for the trunk muscles. For the corticobulbar tract, I say the upper motor neurons enter the brainstem, they cross to the opposite side, and they synapse with cranial nerve nuclei, which are motor, like the oculomotor, the facial, the trigeminal, the hypoglossal. And then the lower motor neurons are going to pass through those nerves and transmit impulses to the head and some to the neck. And where do they end at the brainstem? They end at this point of the brainstem known as the reticular formation, which we shall look at. But just know that the corticobulbar tract, for them, the lower motor neurons end at the brainstem, where we'll have the nuclei of the cranial nerves, and then the impulses are transmitted through the cranial nerves, which are motor. And because cranial nerves supply mainly the head and parts of the neck, that is what the corticobulbar tract supplies, the muscles of the neck and some muscles of the neck and muscles of the head. There are some exceptions for the facial nerve. The facial nerve supplies muscles for both sides, the right and the left, whereas the other ones supply muscles of the opposite side of the body. So the upper motor neurons are going to move up to the brainstem, cross to the opposite side, then they're going to synapse with the lower motor neurons, which are going to pass through the cranial nerves, and they will supply the muscles of the head and neck. The extrapyramidal tract, on the other hand, is made up of the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and tectospinal. The word rubro comes from the red nucleus. The midbrain has a nucleus known as the red nucleus. So when you look at the midbrain, there is a region known as the red nucleus. So rubro comes from the word red, means that the rubrospinal tract originates from the red nucleus, of the midbrain. Then we have the vestibulospinal tract, originating from the vestibular nucleus of the medulla to the spinal cord. That's why they call it the vestibulospinal tract. Reticulospinal tract, from the reticular formation of the brain stem to the spinal cord. That's why they call it reticulospinal tract. Tectospinal tract, from the tectum of the midbrain to the spinal cord. That's why they call it tectospinal tract. And we have realized that these tracts do not originate from the cerebral cortex, but from the parts of the brain stem. So this rubrospinal tract originates from the red nucleus of the midbrain, and it moves down to the spinal cord. Its actions are not voluntary, they are involuntary, but its actions facilitate the voluntary actions of the corticospinal tract. So, when you look at this illustration, we have our midbrain here, and these axons are originating from the midbrain, which is known as the red nucleus. Then they cross and descend on the opposite side as the rubrospinal tract until they reach the spinal cord, where they are going to synapse with second order neurons which are going to transmit those muscles to those impulses to the muscles. So the first order neuron in the rubrospinal tract originates from the red nucleus of the midbrain. So this is the red nucleus of the midbrain, where the first order neuron, which is the upper motor neuron, originates from. Then this upper motor neurons crosses to the opposite side, and it will descend as the rubrospinal tract to the spinal cord. Then it will synapse with a second order neuron or with an interneuron. Sometimes interneurons become second order neurons if they are involved. Then that interneuron will transmit those impulses to the lower motor neuron, which is the third order neuron. Here we are having a third order neuron because we have an interneuron which has come into play. Then this third order neuron is going to go and supply the muscles of the body. So the rubrospinal tract is one of the extrapyramidal tracts whose upper motor neurons originate from the red nucleus of the midbrain. They cross to the opposite side and descend as the rubrospinal tract. And at the spinal cord, they are going to synapse with a small interneuron, which will now become our second order neuron. And this small interneuron will then synapse with the third order neuron, which is the lower motor neuron, and it will transmit those impulses to the muscles of the body. The function of the rubrospinal tract is to facilitate the activity of the flexor muscles and inhibit the activity of the extensor muscles. In other words, there are movements which require flexion of the flexors and relaxations of the extensors. So the rubrospinal tract makes sure that in such movements, the flexors are facilitated to contract, and then the extensors are inhibited from contraction. It is going to control that antagonistic contraction and relaxation, but specifically when it comes to the flexors being stimulated to contract and the extensors inhibited. That's why I'm saying that it facilitates the activity of flexor muscles, but inhibits the activities of extensor muscles of the opposite side of the body. So here we are seeing the red nucleus in the midbrain, and the upper motor neuron is originating from the red nucleus. It crosses to the opposite side and it descends as the rubrospinal tract. When it reaches the spinal cord, it will synapse with a very small interneuron. Then that interneuron will synapse with the lower motor neuron, and the lower motor neuron is going to transmit those impulses to the muscles of the body for the purpose of facilitating flexor muscles and inhibiting extensor muscles in certain types of action which require such a coordination. You can see the red nucleus in the midbrain. This upper motor neuron crosses the opposite side and descends out of the Rubrospinal Tract. When it reaches the spinal cord, it synapses an interneuron. Then the interneuron is going to synapse with the lower motor neuron, which will transmit those impulses to the anterior root to the muscle to inhibit the extensors and excite the flexors. Reticulospinal Tract. This is another component of the extrapyramidal tract which originates from the midbrain. The midbrain is what we call the midbrain has a part known as the tectum, and that part has a structure known as the superior colliculus. So it is originating from the tectum of the midbrain. We shall look at the tectum when it comes to the midbrain, what it is and what it does. So it originates from the tectum of the midbrain to the spinal cord. From the tectum of the midbrain to the spinal cord. So the upper motor neurons originate from the midbrain. They cross to the opposite side, and then they move down as the tectospinal tract until they reach the spinal cord. I repeat, they originate from the midbrain, that part of the midbrain known as the tectum, cross to the opposite side, and they are going to descend as the tectospinal tract to the spinal cord, where they are going to synapse with the lower motor neurons, which will go to supply the muscles, especially of the head and the neck. Tectospinal tract is going to supply muscles of the head and the neck. They originate from the tectum of the midbrain, cross the opposite side, descend as the tectospinal tract. They will go to the spinal cord, and then they will synapse with lower motor neurons of the muscles of the head and the neck. Impulses transmitted through the tectospinal tract are very important, and they are responsible for reflex movement of the head and the neck towards the source of visual stimuli. When a light is shown on your left, you turn your head and the neck to look at the light, reflexly. Reflex movement of the head and the neck towards the source of visual stimuli, that is coordinated by the tectospinal tract, which is part of the extrapyramidal tracts. Vestibulospinal tract. In the pons and the medulla, there is a center or nucleus known as the vestibular nucleus. And it is in the region of the fourth ventricle. We shall look at it when it comes to that time of the medulla and the pons. This vestibular nucleus receives information from the inner ear and the cerebellum. That vestibular nucleus coordinating information from the inner ear and the cerebellum. So for the vestibulospinal tract, the first order neurons originate, or the upper motor neurons originate from the vestibular nucleus of the pons and the medulla oblongata. Then the axons are going to descend without crossing to the spinal cord. Then when they reach the spinal cord, they are going to synapse with interneurons, and the interneurons are going to synapse with the lower motor neurons, which are going to supply the muscles of the body. These ones are carrying out an opposite action to the rubrospinal. For them, they facilitate extensors and inhibit flexors for the purpose of maintaining balance. When your extensors are contracted, you maintain balance. So these ones carry out the opposite function of the rubrospinal. They facilitate the activity of extensors and inhibit the activity of flexors to maintain balance. So there you have our vestibular nucleus, which receives information from the inner ear and the cerebellum. That's the vestibular nucleus. So axons of the upper motor neurons originate from the vestibular nucleus and descend as the vestibulospinal tract, uncrossed until they reach the spinal cord, where they synapse with the interneurons. Then the interneurons synapse with the lower motor neurons, which are going to supply the muscles of the body, whereby they are going to facilitate the action of the extensors and inhibit the action of the flexors to maintain balance. Then we have the reticulospinal tract as the other component of the extrapyramidal tract. The brainstem has a region known as the reticular formation. That reticular formation is very important in stimulating your brain to remain conscious or awake. So these motor neurons originate from the brainstem, where we have the reticular formation. When you look at its illustration, I had some illustrations for those tracts there. So we are having our reticulospinal tract originating from the reticular nuclei. The axons descend uncrossed as the reticulospinal tract until they reach the spinal cord, where they synapse with lower motor neurons, which are going to supply the muscles of the body. That is for the reticulospinal tract. So this reticulospinal tract, it mediates or coordinates movements of muscles of the trunk and muscles of the limb that do not require balance or fine movements of the upper limb by inhibiting them. So in other words, it means that it inhibits the muscles which are not required for balancing. That is when you need to balance. When you need to balance, the muscles which are not needed for your balancing are inhibited. The only muscles which you need to balance are the ones which are facilitated. So that your spinal tract will inhibit those muscles which are not required for the balancing mechanism, so that the muscles which are required for balance take control such that you remain stable. So today we have looked at the descending tracts. We talked about the descending tracts. These are axons of neurons which transmit motor impulses from the brain to the spinal cord, or from the cerebrum to the brainstem and the spinal cord. And they are divided into two: the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tract. The pyramidal tract had the corticospinal and then the corticobulbar. The corticospinal transmits impulses, motor impulses, to the spinal cord, whereas the corticobulbar transmitting impulses to the brainstem. The corticobulbar is responsible for stimulating motor impulses for the cranial nerves, whereas the corticospinal is responsible for transmitting motor impulses for the muscles of the rest of the body. The corticospinal, we saw that the axons which are going to supply the upper and lower limbs cross, whereas the axons which are going to supply the trunk remain on the same side. And when they reach the spinal cord, or the brainstem, they are going to synapse with lower motor neurons, which are going to pass through the anterior root and go to supply the muscles. Sometimes an interneuron is involved, and sometimes it may not be involved. Then the extrapyramidal, we talked about them. They originate from the brainstem and they control involuntary actions. We have talked about the rubrospinal, the tectospinal, the reticulospinal, and the vestibulospinal and their actions. I'm going to give you an assignment to outline the difference between the injuries or lesions of the upper motor neurons and lesions of the lower motor neurons. A lesion is an injury. If the upper motor neuron is injured, what will happen to the muscle? And if a lower motor neuron is injured, what will happen to the muscle? Injuries of the upper motor neuron affect a muscle differently as opposed to injuries of the lower motor neurons. So you're going to look at lesions of the upper motor neurons as opposed to lesions of the lower motor neurons.